The anger inside Charlotte started forcing its way to the surface. No one should be allowed to imprison someone like this with no reason. Charlotte was guilty of nothing except for investigative journalism. This Stork Industries organization had no right to imprison her or anyone else. Like a prisoner of war, Charlotte felt like she had a duty to resist her captors, and the first thing that came to mind was to take off these ridiculous baby clothes. She reached down with her hands and unsnapped her ornaments. She placed her hands on the tapes of her diaper and was about to pull when the lights suddenly turned on. Charlotte had to shield her eyes from the sudden bright light, and she toppled over backwards on her still unsteady legs. She landed on her puffy bottom with legs splayed obscenely wide open for a second. She had clearly got their attention. The door that Nanny had disappeared through opened again, and the robot marched straight back into the room and towards the crib. "Settle down, little one," the nanny said as it reached the crib. Charlotte looked up from the crib into its cold, robotic eyes. She felt fear but also anger towards this thing that had kidnapped her. For a second she just stared at the nanny until she defiantly started reaching down to her diaper again. Like a flash, the side of the crib dropped and the nanny reached in. The cold and metallic hands grabbed Charlotte's wrist before she could process what was happening. She struggled, but the robot seemed infinitely more powerful than she was. "You are being naughty," the nanny said with no strain in its voice. It was as if this was no struggle at all for it. Charlotte found her arms pulled above her head and get strapped down. The leather restraints were around Charlotte's wrists and were attached at the other end to the bars of the crib. "Stop it!" Charlotte yelled with a mixture of panic and anger. Once Charlotte's wrists were restrained, there was nothing that would stop Nanny from grabbing her ankles and restraining them in the same way. Charlotte found herself pinned down to the bed and unable to move any of her limbs a significant amount. To stop Charlotte's shouting and screaming, the nanny brought forward a pacifier gag. Charlotte clamped her mouth closed when she realized what was happening. She was determined to resist this unlawful treatment. "Baby will be quiet," Nanny said without emotion. The robot pinched Charlotte's nose and made it impossible for her to breathe. Charlotte struggled for a second before she was forced to open her mouth. As soon as the gap was there, Nanny pushed the pacifier into the woman's mouth and tied the gag around the back of her head. Charlotte's voice was completely muffled and her futile attempt at resistance was over before it had even started. What she had hoped to achieve, she wasn't sure, but she knew she was now in a worse position than she had been before. If baby is good, she gets rewards. If baby is bad, she gets punished, the nanny said simply. Charlotte watched through eyes swimming with tears as the robot turned and walked away, leaving Charlotte tied up and gagged in her crib. It was a difficult night. Charlotte found it very hard to relax in such an unusual place whilst being tightly tied down. The thick padding between her legs didn't help matters either. It all felt so unnatural that she couldn't relax even when she wanted to. She knew that sleep would be a good idea to give her a chance to be rested if an opportunity to escape came along, but she found everything about her current position prevented any rest. Charlotte must have eventually passed out from exhaustion because the next thing she remembered was waking up to a bright room. As far as she could tell, she was underground and there were no windows to let in any kind of natural light. Instead, the lights in the room seemed to slowly get brighter as if to mimic the sun coming up. Charlotte opened her eyes and remembered where she was almost immediately. Her wrists and ankles felt a little sore from where they had been rubbing against the leather straps that were holding her down. Charlotte's jaw was also very sore from being forced slightly open all night. She had never had a less welcome wake-up call. The door to the nursery opened and Charlotte turned her head to see Nanny coming into the room. Charlotte felt that deep sense of dread in the pit of her stomach as she waited for the robot to make its way over to the crib. "Are you going to be a good girl?" Nanny asked as she stared down at the woman. Charlotte didn't respond. She couldn't talk because of the gag, but she didn't want to nod or shake her head either. She didn't want to give the robot the satisfaction. "Are you going to be a good girl?" Nanny repeated in exactly the same voice. Charlotte knew the nanny wanted her to nod, but the stubbornness that so often helped her when interviewing people was now a hindrance. Despite knowing that it would help her position to just indicate that she would be compliant, Charlotte just couldn't bring herself to do it. The nanny seemingly gave up on waiting for an answer from the young woman. The nanny reached into the crib, and for a second, Charlotte thought that she was going to be let out of the crib anyway. The nanny took the pacifier and pulled it out of the gag. Charlotte gratefully flexed the muscles in her mouth as the pacifier was removed. "I'm a Jern MMHMM." Charlotte had started trying to argue again when she was summarily cut off by a clear tube with a teat on the end that was fastened to the gag. Charlotte felt the tube push into her mouth, and just like the pacifier before it, she found it was impossible to push out. Charlotte would have sworn in surprise if she had been able to, as she followed the tube and found it coming from the nanny's chest. "MMMM." Charlotte mumbled around the tube. She watched in revulsion as a stream of white liquid started coming down the clear cylinder. When the liquid reached the end and started squirting into Charlotte's mouth, she had no choice but to swallow it down. It was cold milk, which was actually quite refreshing to the imprisoned girl. She tried to forget where it was coming from and everything else. Charlotte looked up to the ceiling and just focused on the rhythmic swallowing. By the time Charlotte had swallowed the last of the milk, she felt absolutely full. She felt like her tummy was sloshing around as the milk filled her whole body. The nanny reached down and pulled the tube out of Charlotte's mouth, and the pacifier was put back in. Charlotte could do little more than moan from the fullness in her tummy. The nanny turned around and left the room again. Charlotte watched her go in forced silence as she tried to take in what was happening. Was she being tortured? Were they trying to get information from her?